You think sleep is hard today? Try drifting off in an 1800s asylum where the walls echoed with cries. The beds were nothing more than straw piles. And treatment often meant cold baths or solitary silence. Nurses paced like wardens, restraints. Replaced blankets, and nightfall brought no peace, only shadows. Whispers and dread. Grab your blanket, my friend, and step quietly into a world where sleep was a luxury no one could afford. Tap the bell icon and subscribe for more eerie and forgotten bedtime tales from history. Would you have survived a single night in that asylum? Let me know in the comments. You wake up on July 17, 1851. Not as yourself, but as an observer stepping through the grand entrance of what would become known as the Second Middlesex County Pauper Lunatic Asylum at Colney Hatch. Prince Albert himself has just cut the ribbon on this monument to Victorian ambition. And you can see the pride in the faces of the commissioners and architects as they gesture toward their creation. The building stretches before you like a small city made of brick and moral certainty. Its Italian-style facade, promising something revolutionary in the treatment of society's most vulnerable minds. The sheer scale overwhelms you immediately. 6 miles of corridors wind through this structure, designed to house 1,000 souls deemed unfit for ordinary society. As you walk these halls on opening day, the smell of fresh paint mingles with the institutional odors that will soon define this place: carbolic soap, boiled vegetables, and the particular mustiness that comes from housing too many people in too small a space. The architects have thought of everything, or so they believe. You pass the gasworks that will provide lighting throughout the complex. The brewery where staff will produce the daily ration of beer for patients and workers alike. And the extensive farm that promises to feed this small city while providing therapeutic work for the inmates. There's even an aviary where canaries breed, their bright songs intended to provide cheer in what the designers hope will be a place of healing rather than mere containment. But if you possess the uncomfortable gift of seeing into the future, you know that within 15 years, this building designed for 1,000 will house 2,000 people. The careful ratios of staff to patient will collapse under the weight of too many broken minds and too little funding. The therapeutic workshops will become factories where unpaid patient labor generates income for the county. The spacious wards will be subdivided and subdivided again until patients sleep in beds placed just 2 feet and 6 inches apart. Their troubled dreams bleeding into one another across the narrow gaps. As you observe the opening ceremonies, you notice the careful causellade. You notice the careful attention to detail that reveals Victorian obsessions with classification and control. The building is designed with separate wings for different types of patients: the violent and the melancholic, the curable and the chronic, men and women, the working class and the middle class who have fallen into madness. Each category has its place in this vast machine of treatment, and each place has its rigid schedule that will govern every waking moment. The commissioners speak of moral treatment, of work therapy, of the healing power of fresh air and regular exercise. They point to the extensive grounds where patients will take daily walks, to the workshops where they will learn useful trades, to the chapel where they will find spiritual solace. In their speeches, you hear the genuine conviction that this place will cure madness through kindness, routine, and the application of scientific principles to the disorderly human mind. Yet, even on this first day, if you look closely, you can see the seeds of what this place will become. The locks are heavy and numerous. The windows are barred, ostensibly for safety, but unmistakably for security. The staff carries keys that jangle with each step, and their uniforms are designed for durability rather than comfort. The patients who have been transferred from older, smaller institutions seem small and lost in these grand spaces, their eyes already holding the particular emptiness that comes from institutional life. The daily routine begins to take shape even as the ribbon cutting ends. At precisely 6 a.m., you witness the great unlocking, dozens of ward doors opening simultaneously as attendants begin the morning ritual. Patients are roused from their narrow beds, and the process of washing begins. Each person must be examined, their skin checked for disease, their hair combed and inspected for lice, their general condition noted in the endless ledgers that track every aspect of institutional life. By 9 a.m., after a breakfast of bread and gruel, the patients are moved to the airing courts in closed outdoor spaces where they can walk in circles while the wards are cleaned. You watch this daily migration and understand that this is just the beginning of a routine so precise and unvarying that it will eventually govern not just the patient's days, but their dreams and their capacity to imagine any other way of living. The workshops are already buzzing with activity. The men tend the extensive gardens that produce vegetables for the asylum's kitchen and surplus crops for the London markets. The women sort potatoes, mend clothing, and work in the laundry vast. Rooms filled with steam and the constant sound of scrubbing. In the bookbinding workshop, patients fold and stitch pages that will become account ledgers for businesses across London. In the carpentry shop, they build furniture for new county institutions. Every hand must be busy, every moment productive. Every activity therapeutic in its purpose, if not its effect. But what strikes you most is the sound. With 1,000 people living in close quarters, the asylum is never quiet. Footsteps echo down the 6 miles of corridors, keys jangle, doors slam. Patients call out to one another or to imaginary companions. Attendants bark orders. The mechanical sounds of the workshops never cease. Even at night, when the great building settles into its closest approximation of rest, you can hear the rustling of 2,000 people sleeping too close together, the whispers of those whose minds will not allow them peace, and the steady footsteps of the night attendants making their rounds. As your first day at Colney Hatch draws to a close, you realize that you have witnessed the birth of something unprecedented, a factory for the treatment of madness, run with industrial efficiency and Victorian confidence in the power of systems to solve human problems. But you cannot shake the ebb, feeling that something essential has been lost in translation between the reformers. Noble intentions and the reality of housing 1,000 broken minds under one vast roof. What will happen when the novelty of moral treatment meets the grinding daily reality of managing so many people who cannot manage themselves? 3 years have passed since opening day, and you return to find Colney Hatch transformed from hopeful experiment into grinding routine. The population has swelled to 1,400, and the careful ratios of staff to patient have collapsed under the pressure. What was designed as therapeutic structure has become something else entirely, a machine that processes human aquas. Mommy Kiss, Homie Ruby Kiss, has the luxurious texture that they had. Beings with the same methodical precision that the nearby factories use to process cotton or steel. You witness the 6 a.m. unlocking, now multiplied across dozens of overcrowded wards. The attendants move with practiced efficiency, rousing patients who have learned to wake before the keys turn in their locks. The morning examination has become a hasty inventory. Count the bodies, note any obvious illness, move on to the next ward. The leisurely attention to each patient's condition that was promised in the founding documents has been compressed into a few hurried minutes per person. The breakfast routine reveals how institutional logic has overridden therapeutic intention. Patients queue in long lines for their portions of bread and gruel, served from enormous vats by staff who no longer know individual names or dietary needs. The original plan called for patients to eat in small groups that would simulate family dining, but practical necessity has created a factory-style feeding system where efficiency matters more than dignity. You watch men and women wolf down their portions while standing, afraid that sitting might mean losing their place in the next queue. the next activity, the next small privilege that makes institutional life bearable. The move to the airing courts has become a military exercise. Attendants herd groups of 50 or more patients through the corridors and out into the enclosed yards where they walk in large circles, supervised by staff who carry thick wooden sticks and watch for any sign of agitation or escape attempts. The original vision of peaceful garden strolls has evolved into something that looks more like a prison exercise yard, complete with walls too high to see over and gates that lock behind each group as they enter. In the workshops, the pretense of therapy has given way to the reality of production quotas. The carpentry shop now operates on piecework systems where patients must complete a certain number of items per day to earn their full meals. The laundry processes not just linens from the asylum, but paying work from London hotels and boarding houses with patient labor providing profit to the county commissioners. You watch women stand for 12-hour shifts over steaming washtubs, their hands raw from lye soap, their conversation forbidden during working hours. The garden plots that were meant to provide therapeutic activity have become a serious agricultural operation. Patients work in gangs of 20, supervised by staff who care more about crop yields than the mental state of the workers. The asylum's farm now produces enough vegetables to feed its population and generate surplus for sale at London markets. You see men bent over rows of turnips and potatoes, their movements mechanical, their eyes vacant. The connection between meaningful work and mental health has been lost in the drive for institutional self-sufficiency. Evening brings its own regimented horrors. At 8 p.m. precisely, the great locking begins. Patients are herded back to wards, where they sleep in beds placed so close together that you can hear every cough, every nightmare, every restless turning throughout the night. The attendants walk these wards every hour, carrying lanterns that cast moving shadows on the walls and disturb whatever fitful sleep the patients manage to find. You discover that Colney Hatch has developed its own internal economy of privileges and punishments. Patients who complete their work assignments without complaint earn small rewards, an extra portion of bread, permission to tend the canaries in the aviary, or a few minutes of unsupervised time in the gardens. Those who resist the routine face a carefully calibrated series of punishments: reduced meals, isolation in single cells, or exclusion from the workshops that provide the only variety in their otherwise monotonous days. The asylum has also developed its own social hierarchy among patients. Those who arrive with middle-class backgrounds often become ward supervisors, helping attendants maintain order in exchange for better sleeping quarters and improved meals. Former servants and laborers form the bulk of the population, accepting their lot with the same resigned submission they showed to earthly employers. At the bottom are those whose madness makes them difficult to manage. They face constant supervision, frequent punishment, and the gradual erosion of whatever human dignity they brought with them. Staff turnover has become a serious problem. The attendants hired at opening were selected for their moral character and given basic training in humane treatment. But the reality of managing hundreds of mentally ill people has proven too much. For many, they quit and are replaced by whoever will accept the low pay and difficult conditions. The new staff often come from the same social class as the patients, and the distinction between keeper and kept becomes increasingly blurred. The medical staff, once optimistic about their ability to cure madness through moral treatment, have retreated into administrative duties. The asylum's doctors spend their days completing paperwork required by county officials and parliamentary commissioners rather than providing individual treatment to patients. The careful case notes and treatment plans that were maintained in the early months have given way to brief, weekly summaries that note only the most dramatic incidents. You observe that the asylum has developed its own peculiar rhythms and seasons. Summer brings relief as patients can spend more time outdoors, but it also brings the smell of too many unwashed bodies confined in inadequate space. Winter forces everyone inside, creating an atmosphere of barely controlled claustrophobia that often explodes into violence. Christmas and Easter provide brief respites with special meals and amateur entertainment, but they also highlight how completely cut off these people are from the normal rhythms of family and community life, the promised. Religious services continue, but they too have become routine rather than spiritual. The chaplain delivers the same sermon to the same faces week after week, his words falling on ears that have learned to endure rather than hope. The hymns are sung by voices that have forgotten how to express joy, and the prayers often become occasions for patients to voice complaints about their treatment. Complaints that are duly noted and promptly ignored as you complete your second extended observation of Colney Hatch. You begin to understand that something fundamental has gone wrong with the grand experiment in moral treatment. The building itself is magnificent. The staff is generally well-intentioned, and the routine provides structure and purpose. But the system has become larger than the people it was meant to serve. The patients have been transformed from individuals deserving care into units to be managed, and the staff has evolved from healers into guards. What began as an attempt to cure madness has become a very efficient method for containing it. But what happens when the container becomes too small for what it holds? By 1866, 15 years after Prince Albert's ribbon cutting, you return to find that Colney Hatch has achieved a kind of terrible perfection. The building now houses over 2,000 patients, double its intended capacity, and the institution has evolved into something its founders never imagined, a self-contained industrial community that happens to be populated entirely by people society has declared insane. The morning routine now resembles a factory shift change more than a medical procedure. At 5:30 a.m., the night attendants begin the Great Awakening, moving through wards packed with beds placed so close together that staff must step carefully to avoid disturbing sleeping patients. The examination process has been reduced to a head count and a quick visual check for obvious injuries or illnesses. Patients dress themselves if they can, or remain in the rough institutional nightgowns that have become the new form of chronic cases. The breakfast system has evolved into a marvel of institutional efficiency. Enormous kettles produce hundreds of gallons of gruel, while staff slice thousands of pieces of bread with mechanical precision. Patients queue in lines that stretch down the corridors, each holding a tin bowl and spoon that constitute their only personal possessions. The meal is consumed in 15 minutes, after which the bowls are collected, washed, and stacked for the next meal. You notice that many patients have learned to eat standing up, ready to move to their next assigned activity the moment their bowl is empty. The workshops have become the beating heart of the asylum's economy. The carpentry shop now employs 60 patients who work in shifts to produce furniture for county institutions across England. The bookbinding operation processes thousands of volumes annually, with patients working at long tables under the supervision of skilled craftsmen hired from London. The tailoring workshop produces not only clothing for asylum inmates, but uniforms for workhouses and prisons throughout the region down in the laundry. 150 women work in conditions that would be illegal in any commercial establishment. The rooms are filled with steam from enormous vats of boiling water, and the air is thick with lye soap and carbolic acid. Patients work 12-hour shifts, washing linens not just for the asylum, but for paying customers throughout North London. The work is dangerous. You witness several patients with burns from hot water and lye, and the constant dampness has given many of them chronic respiratory problems. The farm operation has expanded to include dairy cattle, pigs, and poultry in addition to the extensive vegetable gardens. Male patients work as agricultural laborers, tending crops that feed the institution and produce surplus for London markets. The asylum's annual reports now boast of producing thousands of pounds of potatoes, turnips, and cabbages, along with thousands of gallons of milk and hundreds of eggs daily. The patients who perform this labor receive no wages, but their work generates significant revenue for the county. Commissioners.u discovered that the asylum has developed its own internal class system based on work assignments. At the top are the useful patients who have learned skilled trades and can be trusted with minimal supervision. They often serve as informal supervisors of less capable patients and enjoy better food, private sleeping quarters, and occasional privileges like visits to nearby villages. In the middle are the working patients who perform routine labor, but require constant oversight. At the bottom are the chronic cases, patients whose mental state makes them unsuitable for productive work and who spend their days in enforced idleness or simple repetitive tasks. The medical model of treatment has been almost entirely abandoned in favor of management and containment. The doctors now function primarily as administrators, processing admissions, completing required paperwork, and dealing with the legal and bureaucratic requirements of running what has become a major county institution. Individual treatment plans exist only on paper, and most patients go weeks or months without any meaningful contact with medical staff. The attendants have evolved into a semi-military force responsible for maintaining order among 2,000 people with varying degrees of mental illness. Many carry clubs or other weapons, and the uniform they wear resembles that of prison guards more than hospital staff. Turnover remains high, but the institution has adapted by hiring from an increasingly rough population of men and women who view the work primarily as steady employment rather than a calling to heal the sick. Patient deaths have become routine occurrences that barely register in the institution's consciousness. The mortality rate has climbed steadily as overcrowding creates conditions that spread disease rapidly through the wards. Tuberculosis, influenza, and dysentery kill dozens of patients annually, but their deaths are recorded as inevitable consequences of mental illness rather than institutional failure. Bodies are buried in the asylum cemetery with minimal ceremony, their graves marked only by numbers. The social life of the asylum has taken on its own peculiar character. Patients have formed informal communities based on shared work assignments, ward locations, or regional origins. Many have been institutionalized so long that they can barely remember their lives before Colney Hatch, and they relate to each other more as family members than as fellow patients. Long-term inmates often serve as mentors to newcomers, teaching them the unwritten rules that govern institutional survival. Religious services continue, but they have been adapted to serve the institution's need for order rather than patience. Spiritual needs. The weekly service has become an occasion for counting patients, distributing announcements, and reinforcing the asylum's authority structure. The chaplain's sermons emphasize duty, obedience, and acceptance of one's fate, themes that serve the institution's stability more than the patient's. Souls. Entertainment consists of occasional concerts by the patients themselves, usually featuring singers or musicians who maintain some of their pre-admission skills. Amateur theatrical performances are mounted several times a year, with patients playing all roles and creating their own costumes from institutional materials. These events provide brief respites from routine, but they also highlight how completely cut off the patients are from the broader cultural life of Victorian England as you complete your final observation of Colney Hatch. You realize that the institution has succeeded brilliantly at everything except its original purpose. It efficiently houses, feeds, and employs 2,000 people who might otherwise be burdens on their communities. It generates revenue through patient labor and maintains order through strict routine and discipline. It provides jobs for hundreds of staff members and serves as a model for similar institutions throughout the British Empire. But it has utterly failed to cure madness or even to treat it in any meaningful sense. Instead, it has created a parallel society where madness is not healed but industrialized, transformed into a resource that can be managed, directed, and made profitable. The patients are no longer individuals suffering from mental illness. They have become the workforce of an institution dedicated to its own perpetuation. The question that haunts every corridor and workshop is not whether anyone will recover, but whether this vast machine of human containment has become too powerful and too profitable ever to be stopped. You step through the gates of Bicêtre Hospital in Paris on a cold morning in September 1793. Your footsteps echoing off cobblestones, still damp with the morning's rain. The revolution rages through the streets of Paris, but within these walls. A different kind of revolution is about to begin, one measured not in dramatic proclamations or violent upheavals, but in the quiet sound of chains being removed from human limbs. Philippe Pinel, the newly appointed physician-in-chief, walks beside you through corridors that seem to exist in a different century entirely. The building dates to the 17th century, and its stone walls hold the accumulated suffering of generations of society's unwanted criminals, beggars, prostitutes, and the mad, all thrown together in a system that makes no distinction between poverty and insanity, between criminality and mental illness. The air carries a smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and something else, the particular odor of despair that comes from housing hundreds of people who have been written off. By society, the sound that dominates everything is the constant rattling and clanking of chains. As you pass through the wards designated for the insane, you see them everywhere. Heavy iron shackles around ankles, thick chains connecting patients to walls, metal collars that restrict head movement, and elaborate contraptions that bind entire bodies in rigid positions. The patients wear these restraints not for a few hours or days, but for months and years at a time. Some have been chained to the same spot for so long that grooves have been worn in the stone floor beneath their feet. Pinel moves through these scenes with the careful attention of a natural scientist observing specimens, but there is something else in his expression, a quality of horror mixed with intellectual curiosity that suggests he sees not just the physical condition of these patients, but the human tragedy they represent. He has been trained in the medical theories of his time, which hold that madness results from an excess of certain bodily humors that must be purged through bleeding, vomiting, and other violent interventions. But his observations at Bicêtre are already suggesting that these treatments may do more harm than good. You watch him stop before a patient named Jean-Baptiste Poussin, a man who was once a patient himself but has been elevated to the position of governor of the insane wards. Poussin's own history of mental illness gives him an unusual perspective on the treatment of madness. He has experienced both the patient's helplessness and the keeper's authority, and he has developed ideas about managing the insane that run counter to conventional wisdom. In whispered conversations with Pinel, he describes experiments in removing chains from certain patients, providing them with work to occupy their minds, and treating them with a degree of respect that other attendants consider dangerous. The daily routine at Bicêtre follows patterns established over centuries of institutional tradition. Patients are awakened before dawn by attendants who unlock the chains that bind them to their sleeping quarters. Those considered dangerous remain chained throughout the day, while others are allowed limited movement within the wards. Meals consist of thin gruel and bread distributed from buckets, with patients eating from their hands or from crude bowls when such luxuries are available. Medical treatment, when it occurs at all, involves purging, bleeding, and the application of various caustic substances to the skin. But Pinel is beginning to question everything about these practices. You observe him spending hours simply talking with patients, a revolutionary approach in an era when madness is considered to render speech meaningless. He listens to their accounts of their symptoms, their histories, their fears and hopes. He discovers that many patients can describe their conditions with remarkable clarity and insight, contradicting the prevailing belief that mental illness destroys all rational faculties. In his private quarters each evening, you find Pinel keeping detailed notes about individual patients, recording not just their symptoms, but their personalities, their responses to different treatments, and their Capacity for rational conversation. These case studies represent a radically new approach to mental illness. Instead of viewing madness as a uniform condition requiring uniform treatment, Peniel is beginning to see it as a collection of different disorders affecting individuals. In different ways, the political atmosphere of revolutionary Paris adds another layer of complexity to Pinot's work. The new government has proclaimed the rights of man and citizen, but it remains unclear whether these rights extend to the mad. Some revolutionary leaders view the inmates of Bicêtre as victims of aristocratic oppression who deserve liberation, along with other oppressed classes. Others see them as dangerous elements who must be controlled for the safety of society. Pinel must navigate these competing ideologies while developing his own understanding of what it means to treat mental illness humanely. You witness the first experimental removal of chains from a patient who has been restrained for over 2 years. The man's name is Sheben, and he has been considered so dangerous that even the most hardened attendants approach him with caution. But when Poussin removes his chains under Pinel's supervision, something remarkable happens. Instead of flying into a violent rage as everyone expects, Sheben sits quietly for several minutes, rubbing circulation back into his arms and legs. When he finally speaks, his first words are to thank his liberators and to ask for a cup of water. This scene, repeated with patient after patient over the following weeks, begins to reveal the fundamental flaw in traditional approaches to madness. The violence and agitation that were seen as symptoms of mental illness often turn out to be natural human responses to brutal treatment. Remove the chains, provide basic dignity and respect, and many patients reveal capacities for rational behavior that their restraints had prevented them from demonstrating. But the process is neither simple nor consistently successful. Some patients do become violent when their restraints are removed, and Pinel must develop new methods of managing dangerous behavior without resorting to chains. He experiments with isolation rooms furnished with soft materials with work assignments that exhaust aggressive energy, and with a system of privileges and restrictions that encourages good behavior without relying on physical punishment. The staff at Bicêtre watches these experiments with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Many attendants have worked in the institution for decades, and they have developed their own methods of survival in an environment where violence and chaos are constant threats. Pinel's approach requires them to interact with patients as human beings rather than as dangerous animals, and this change in perspective proves difficult for men and women who have learned to see madness as fundamentally threatening. As winter approaches in 1793, you observe that Pinot's reforms are beginning to transform not just individual patients, but the atmosphere of entire wards. Rooms that once echoed with the sound of chains and the screams of restrained patients now buzz with conversation, work activity, and something that might almost be called normal social interaction. Patients who have not spoken coherently in years begin to engage in meaningful dialogue with staff and with each other. But questions remain that will shape everything that follows. Can this gentler approach to madness actually cure mental illness, or does it merely make institutional life more tolerable? How can society balance its need for protection from dangerous individuals with the moral obligation to treat all humans with dignity? And what will happen when word of Pinel's experiments spreads beyond the walls of Bicêtre to challenge centuries of accepted wisdom about the nature and treatment of madness? 2 years have passed since those first chains fell to the floor of Bicêtre, and you return to find Philippe Pinel deep in the patient work of revolutionizing not just how madness is treated, but how it is understood. The transformation is evident. The moment you enter the hospital, gone are the constant sounds of rattling metal and anguished cries that once defined this place. Instead, you hear something remarkable: ordinary human conversation. The sound of people talking with each other rather than screaming at phantoms or begging for relief from physical torment. Peniel has moved beyond the dramatic gesture of removing chains to the more complex work of developing what he calls treatment, moral treatment. This approach rests on a revolutionary premise, that madness, rather than being a complete destruction of human reason, is a distortion of normal mental processes that can potentially be corrected through careful observation, humane care, and systematic intervention. You watch him conduct his morning rounds, notebook in hand, recording observations about each patient with the methodical attention of a natural philosopher, studying plant specimens or astronomical phenomena. The daily routine at Bicketer has been completely restructured around Peniel's theories. Patients rise at dawn, but instead of being chained to walls or confined to cramped cells, they move freely within designated areas of the hospital. The morning begins with washing, not the perfunctory cleaning that was once administered to inmates like grooming livestock, but a process that respects human dignity and allows patients to participate in their own care. You observe attendants who have learned to approach each patient as an individual, noting their preferences, their capabilities, and their particular needs. Breakfast has become a social occasion rather than a feeding operation. Patients sit at Prisocles. Patients sit at Prisocles. At Prisocles, sit at Prisocles. Long-lasting color. Noting their preferences, my laskant. Noting their preferences, their claisant, my capabilities. And their picati Prisocles, to pay yourself. My cuseat, my sate, my sekat, say waske sit, my likesisik berry, that be aside, by my glove. Priso da tikel ficalisik and grad, ko we con to send you so echo kisik sit is it siki it's I me less it kitalena I bit it gadi it sit to the what it stick eto it be sick break it tables in groups of 6 to 8, engaging in conversation while they eat bread and drink the thin coffee that has replaced the gruel of earlier years. Peniel believes that normal social interaction is essential to mental health, and he has structured mealtimes to encourage the kind of ordinary human exchange that institutional life typically destroys. You notice that many patients who are mute for years have begun to speak during these meals. Their voices rusty from disuse, but eager to reconnect with human community. Work has become central to Peniel's approach, but not the mindless labor that characterizes most institutional settings. Instead, patients are assigned tasks that match their capabilities and interests. Skilled craftsmen continue to practice their trades. Former farmers tend the hospital's garden plots, and those with educational backgrounds assist with record keeping and correspondence. The work serves multiple purposes. It occupies minds that might otherwise dwell on disturbing thoughts. It maintains practical skills that patients may need if they recover sufficiently to leave the institution, and it provides a sense of purpose and dignity that pure dependency destroys. You watch Peniel conduct what he calls moral conversations with individual patients, extended discussions that explore their symptoms, their life histories, and their understanding of their own conditions. These sessions represent a complete departure from traditional medical practice, which viewed the mad as incapable of rational communication. Instead, Peniel approaches each patient as a person whose thoughts and feelings, however disordered, contain valuable information about their condition and their prospects for recovery. One patient, a former silk merchant named Asylum, who has been at Bicketer for 3 years, demonstrates the potential of this approach. When you first encountered him 2 years ago, he spent his days muttering to himself and striking violent poses that suggested he was fighting invisible enemies. Under Peniel's care, he has gradually revealed that his madness began after a series of business failures that left him bankrupt and homeless. The violent episodes were his way of expressing rage at creditors and business partners who he believed had betrayed him. Through patient conversation and gradual building of trust, Pinel has helped Haslam understand the connection between his financial losses and his mental distress, and the patient has begun to develop more constructive ways of dealing with his anger and despair. But not every case yields to moral treatment, and Pinel is learning to classify different types of mental illness based on their response to his interventions. Some patients suffer from what he calls melancholia, a condition characterized by profound sadness and withdrawal that often improves when patients are encouraged to engage in meaningful activity and social interaction. Others display mania, periods of excessive excitement and energy that can be managed through a combination of calming activities and gentle restraint that does not rely on chains or violence. The most challenging cases involve patients whose symptoms seem to have no connection to external circumstances or rational thought processes. These individuals, whom Pinel categorizes as suffering from dementia, display persistent delusions, hear voices that no one else can hear or exhibit, behaviors that appear completely disconnected from reality. While moral treatment makes their lives more comfortable and dignified, it rarely produces the dramatic improvements seen in patients whose madness stems from identifiable life circumstances. Staff training has become crucial to the success of moral treatment. Pinel has developed a systematic program for educating attendants about the principles of humane care, teaching them to observe patient behavior scientifically rather than simply reacting to it emotionally. You observe training sessions where attendants learn to recognize the early signs of agitation, to intervene with calm conversation rather than physical force, and to understand that much of what appears to be random madness actually follows patterns that can be observed and influenced. The physical environment of Bicketer has been transformed to support these new approaches to treatment. Rooms once used for chaining violent patients have been converted into workshops where inmates can engage in productive activity. A library has been established where literate patients can read books and newspapers, maintaining their connection to the intellectual life of the broader society. Gardens have been expanded and improved, providing spaces where patients can work outdoors and experience the seasonal rhythms that institutional life typically obscures. But Pinel's most significant innovation may be his systematic record-keeping. You spend an evening in his study examining the detailed case histories he maintains for each patient, documents that record not just medical symptoms but personality traits, family backgrounds, social circumstances, and responses to different treatments. These records represent the beginning of psychiatric medicine as a scientific discipline, based on careful observation and systematic analysis rather than theoretical speculation about the nature of madness. The success of moral treatment at Bicketer has begun to attract attention from physicians and reformers throughout Europe. Visitors arrive regularly to observe Pinel's methods and to interview patients about their experiences. Some are skeptical, arguing that removing chains and treating the mad with kindness will inevitably result in chaos and violence. Others are convinced that Pinel has discovered fundamental truths about human nature that have applications far beyond the treatment of mental illness. As you prepare to leave Bicketer after this second extended visit, you recognize that Pinel has accomplished something remarkable. He has demonstrated that madness need not be treated as a moral failing or a supernatural curse, but can be approached as a medical condition that responds to systematic intervention. His patients are not cured in any simple sense, but they have been restored to their humanity and given the possibility of improvement rather than the certainty of deterioration. Yet questions remain that will determine whether moral treatment becomes a lasting reform or merely a temporary experiment. Can Pinel's methods be applied successfully in other institutions with different populations and different resources? Will society accept the increased cost and complexity of treating the mad as human beings rather than simply containing them as dangerous animals? And what will happen when less skilled or less committed physicians attempt to implement moral treatment without Pinel's deep understanding of its theoretical foundations and practical requirements? By 1804, 11 years after those first chains fell at Bicketer, you return to find that Philippa Pinel's quiet revolution has spread far beyond the walls of a single Parisian hospital. The man who once walked cautiously among chained patients now stands as the acknowledged leader of a movement that is transforming the treatment of mental illness throughout Europe and beginning to cross the Atlantic to influence American practice. But success has brought its own complications, and you discover that moral treatment faces challenges that its founder could never have anticipated. The transformation of Bicketer is now complete and startling to anyone who remembers the institution's earlier incarnation. The wards buzz with purposeful activity as patients engage in work assignments, educational programs, and social activities. That would have been unimaginable under the old system. You walk through workshops where former inmates have become skilled craftsmen, past gardens where patients grow vegetables for the hospital kitchen, and into recreation rooms where evening entertainments feature music, reading, and conversation that displays the intellectual capabilities that chains once concealed. Pinel himself has evolved from experimental physician to international authority on mental illness. His systematic case studies have been compiled into publications that circulate among medical professionals throughout Europe. And his theories about the classification and treatment of different types of madness have begun to establish psychiatry as a legitimate medical specialty. You observe him conducting tours for visiting physicians, patiently explaining the principles of moral treatment and demonstrating the remarkable transformations that humane care can produce in patients once considered hopelessly insane. But the success of moral treatment has also revealed its limitations and complexities. As word of Pinel's methods has spread, Bicketer has received an influx of patients from throughout France and beyond. Straining the resources and careful patient-to-staff ratios that made the original reforms possible. The institution now houses over 300 patients, many of whom suffer from conditions that respond poorly to moral treatment despite the humane care they receive. You witness Pinel grappling with cases that challenge his optimistic belief in the power of kindness and rationale. Discourse to heal disordered minds. Some patients, particularly those suffering from what would later be understood as schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, require constant supervision and occasionally become violent despite the gentlest treatment. Others suffer from dementia or brain injuries that no amount of moral intervention can reverse. These cases force Pinel to confront the limits of his approach and to develop more complex theories about the different causes and types of mental illness. The training of staff has become increasingly sophisticated as moral treatment has evolved from experiment to established practice. You observe Pinel conducting seminars for attendants where he teaches them to recognize the subtle signs of different mental conditions, to intervene appropriately when patients become agitated, and to maintain the delicate balance between therapeutic structure and human freedom that moral treatment requires. The attendants themselves have been transformed from jailers to something approaching medical professionals, with specialized knowledge about the treatment of mental illness. The economic implications of moral treatment have become a source of ongoing concern for hospital administrators and government officials. Humane treatment is significantly more expensive than simple containment. It requires more staff, better facilities, and ongoing investment in patient programs and activities. The workshops at Bicketer now produce enough income to offset some of these costs. But the fundamental economics of treating mental illness rather than merely housing the insane presence challenges that many institutions are reluctant to accept. International visitors have carried Pinel's ideas throughout Europe and across the Atlantic. But the translation of moral treatment to different cultural contexts has produced mixed results. You read correspondence from physicians in England, Germany, and America who describe their attempts to implement Pinel's methods, often with modifications that reflect local conditions and attitudes. Some report dramatic successes similar to those achieved at Bicketer, while others struggle with staff resistance, inadequate funding, or cultural attitudes that view kindness to the insane as dangerous. Sentimentality. The philosophical implications of moral treatment extend far beyond medical practice to challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. If madness can be improved through humane treatment, what does this say about other forms of social deviance and criminal behavior? If the insane retain their essential humanity despite their symptoms, how should society treat other marginalized populations, prisoners, beggars, prostitutes, and political dissidents? P. Neal has begun to document the long-term outcomes of moral treatment, following patients who have left Bicketer to return to their communities or to live in supervised settings outside the hospital. The results are encouraging but complex. Many patients who showed dramatic improvement within the supportive environment of the reformed institution experience relapses when they encounter the stresses and challenges of ordinary social life. This pattern raises questions about whether moral treatment cures mental illness or simply manages it more humanely. The development of case study methodology under Pinnell's direction has transformed the understanding of mental illness from a collection of superstitions and theoretical speculations into something approaching scientific knowledge. You examine the detailed records that now exist for hundreds of patients, documenting their symptoms, treatments, and outcomes with unprecedented precision. These records reveal patterns that were invisible when madness was treated as a uniform condition requiring uniform intervention, religious and political. Authorities have responded to moral treatment with a mixture of support and suspicion. Some view Pinnell's emphasis on human dignity and rational discourse as consistent with Enlightenment values and Christian charity. Others worry that treating the insane as fellow human beings rather than as fundamentally different creatures undermines social hierarchies and challenges divine authority over human suffering. The influence of moral treatment on broader medical practice has begun to extend beyond the treatment of mental illness. Pinnell's emphasis on careful observation, detailed record keeping, and systematic classification has contributed to the development of clinical medicine as a scientific discipline. His approach to understanding disease as a process that can be studied and influenced rather than simply endured has applications throughout medical practice. As you complete your final observation of Bicketer under Pinnell's direction, you recognize that moral treatment represents both a remarkable achievement and an ongoing challenge. Pinnell has demonstrated beyond question that mental illness need not condemn individuals to lives of misery and degradation, and that humane treatment can restore dignity and possibility to lives that seemed beyond hope. His systematic approach to understanding and treating madness has laid the foundations for modern psychiatry and challenged society to reconsider its obligations to its most vulnerable members. But the broader implementation of moral treatment faces obstacles that a single brilliant physician working in one exceptional institution cannot overcome alone. The expansion of humane treatment requires not just medical knowledge, but social commitment, adequate resources, and cultural changes that challenge deeply rooted attitudes about madness, deviance, and human worth. The question that will determine Pinnell's ultimate legacy is whether the principles he has established can survive the transition from experimental innovation to widespread practice, and whether society is prepared to accept the costs and complexities of treating mental illness as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. You accompany Dorothea Lynn Dix on a cold, January morning in 1841 as she makes her way through the snow-covered streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, carrying her well-worn Bible and a small bag containing religious pamphlets. At 39, she has established herself as a successful author of educational materials and a dedicated teacher. But nothing in her comfortable middle-class existence has prepared her for what she will encounter when she volunteers to teach Sunday school to female inmates at the East Cambridge Jail. This seemingly routine act of Christian charity will transform her into one of America's most powerful social reformers and change the course of mental health treatment throughout the nation. The jail presents itself as a typical local institution, a solid brick building designed to hold petty criminals, debtors, and vagrants, until they can be processed through the local court system. But as Dix follows the jailer through increasingly dim corridors, she begins to sense that something is fundamentally wrong with this place. The air grows colder as they descend toward the basement cells, and she notices that her breath forms clouds in the frigid atmosphere. When she asks about heating, the jailer explains matter-of-factly that heat is considered unnecessary for criminals and that providing warmth might make imprisonment too comfortable to serve as an effective deterrent to crime. The first cell she enters contains 3 women huddled together for warmth under a single thin blanket. They are not the hardened criminals she expected, but rather women whose circumstances, unemployment, abandonment by family, or simple poverty have led them to minor offenses like begging or stealing food. But it is the next cell that changes everything for Dix. Here she finds 2 women who are clearly suffering from mental illness. One rocking back and forth while muttering incomprehensibly to herself, the other sitting motionless in a corner, staring at the wall with empty eyes. When Dix asks the jailer why these women are confined with criminals, he explains that they are considered dangerous lunatics who have nowhere else to go. The local almshouse is already overcrowded, and these women have no family members willing or able to care for them. The jail has become their home by default, and they have been living in these unheated cells for months with no medical care, no treatment for their conditions, and no hope of improvement or release. The conversation that follows with these women reveals the deeper tragedy of their situation. Despite their obvious mental distress, both retain enough awareness to understand their circumstances and to articulate their suffering. One describes the voices she hears and the visions that torment her, but she also speaks coherently about her life before madness overtook her. She was a seamstress who supported her elderly mother until her symptoms became too severe for her to work. The other woman says little, but when Dick speaks gently to her, she responds with tears that suggest she understands her abandonment and degradation more clearly than anyone realizes, as Dix continues her Sunday school visits over the following weeks. She begins to investigate the conditions in the jail more systematically. She discovers that the treatment of mentally ill inmates is not an oversight or temporary arrangement, but rather the standard practice throughout Massachusetts and most of America. Society has developed no systematic approach to caring for people with mental illness, leaving families to cope as best they can until crisis or exhaustion forces them to surrender their relatives to whatever local institution will accept them. The jailer, initially defensive about his treatment of the mentally ill inmates, gradually becomes an ally as Dix demonstrates genuine interest in understanding rather than simply criticizing the system. He explains that he receives no special training or resources for caring for people with mental illness, that local authorities provide no guidance about appropriate treatment, and that public opinion generally views madness as either a moral failing or a divine punishment that requires no intervention beyond basic containment. Dix begins to spend additional time at the jail beyond her Sunday school duties, observing daily routines and talking with staff about their experiences caring for mentally ill inmates. She discovers that the jailer and his staff often struggle with feelings of helplessness and frustration when confronted with behaviors they cannot understand or control. Some have developed crude but well-intentioned strategies for managing difficult patients, while others have hardened themselves to suffering they feel powerless to relieve. The legal framework governing the treatment mentally ill people proves to be a patchwork of local customs and ancient laws that provide no consistent protection or care standards. Dix learns that families can have relatives committed to local institutions with minimal legal oversight, that patients have virtually no rights or protections once institutionalized, and that the length of confinement depends more on local officials' convenience than on any assessment of the person's condition or prospects for recovery. Her investigation expands beyond the East Cambridge Jail to include visits to almshouses, private madhouses, and other institutions throughout Massachusetts. The pattern she discovers is both consistent and horrifying. Mentally ill people are routinely confined in unheated cells, chained to walls or furniture to prevent escape, and provided with minimal food and no medical care. Many have been naked or nearly naked for months or years, their clothing having rotted away in the damp conditions. With no provision for replacement garments, the economic factors underlying this neglect become clear as Dix examines local budgets and speaks with town officials. Caring for mentally ill people properly would require significant public expenditure at a time when most communities are struggling to provide basic services to their general populations. Officials view the insane as unproductive burdens on society who deserve only the minimal care necessary to prevent them from dying or escaping to trouble their neighbors. At the same time, Dix begins to research alternative approaches to mental illness treatment that are being developed in Europe and in a few pioneering American institutions. She corresponds with reformers who describe the principles of moral treatment, visits the few American hospitals that are experimenting with humane care for mental patients, and studies the writings of physicians who argue that mental illness can be treated rather than simply contained. The contrast between what she observes in local jails and almshouses and what she learns about enlightened treatment approaches convinces Dix that the suffering she has witnessed is not inevitable, but rather the result of ignorance, indifference, and inadequate resources. This realization transforms her from a casual volunteer into a committed reformer determined to document the scope of the problem and to demand systematic change from state government. As winter turns to spring in 1841, Dix begins to formulate a plan that will require her to violate every social convention governing proper behavior for unmarried middle-class women. She will travel alone throughout Massachusetts, visiting every institution that houses mentally ill people, documenting conditions in meticulous detail, and then presenting her findings to the state legislature in a formal petition demanding action. The plan terrifies her, but her sense of moral obligation to the suffering women she encountered in that frozen jail cell compels her to proceed. Her first challenge will be gaining access to institutions whose officials have every reason to conceal their practices from public scrutiny. Her second will be collecting evidence that is detailed enough to convince skeptical legislators without being so graphic that it violates contemporary standards of public discourse. Her third and most difficult challenge will be finding a way to present her case to male political leaders who are unaccustomed to taking direction from women and may view her activism as inappropriate interference in public affairs. But as Dix prepares for this unprecedented campaign, she carries with her the memory of those women in the East Cambridge Jail, their suffering, their dignity despite their circumstances, and their humanity that no amount of neglect and degradation could destroy. The question that will drive her through the months of investigation and advocacy that follow is whether American society can be made to see what she has seen and to acknowledge its moral obligation to treat mental illness as a medical condition, deserving of care rather than a social problem requiring only containment. 18 months after that first shocking encounter at East Cambridge Jail, you accompanied Dorothea Dix on her methodical journey through the hidden landscape of Massachusetts. Institutions traveling by carriage along rural roads to almshouses, jails, and private establishments that house the mentally ill. She has evolved from horrified observer to systematic investigator, carrying detailed notebooks where she records not just the physical conditions she encounters, but the personal histories and individual suffering that official reports reduce to statistical abstractions. The scope of her investigation has expanded far beyond what any reasonable person might have attempted. In an era when respectable women rarely travel alone and never intrude into the masculine domains of politics and public policy. Dix has visited over 300 facilities across Massachusetts, documenting conditions with the methodical precision of a natural scientist and the moral passion of a religious crusader. Her notebooks contain sketches of restraint devices, floor plans of institutions, transcripts of conversations with patients and staff, and detailed financial analyses of institutional budgets. Each institution presents its own particular version of the same fundamental problem: society's complete failure to develop coherent policies for caring for people with mental illness. At the Worcester County Almshouse, you witness Dix's careful documentation of a woman who has been chained to a cellar wall for 3 years. Her mental condition having deteriorated from what may have been treatable depression into complete withdrawal from human contact. The woman's family surrendered her to the almshouse when her symptoms made it impossible for her to work, and local officials confined her in the cellar when her nighttime disturbances bothered other residents. Dix's methodology has become sophisticated through practice and painful experience. She approaches each institution with letters of introduction from local clergymen or civic leaders, presenting herself as a concerned citizen rather than a critic or reformer. This strategy allows her to gain access to facilities that might otherwise refuse entry. It also requires her to maintain a careful balance between expressing appropriate concern for conditions she observes and avoiding confrontations that might end her investigations prematurely. The private madhouses present particular challenges because their owners have financial incentives to conceal poor conditions, while presenting themselves as providing superior care to families willing to pay for their services. At one establishment near Springfield, Dix discovers that the proprietor advertises modern moral treatment, while actually confining patients in basement cells and providing no medical care beyond occasional purging and bleeding. The contrast between the facility's public reputation and its actual practices illustrates how easily families can be deceived when desperation drives them to seek care for mentally ill relatives. Her documentation reveals patterns that extend far beyond individual institutional failures to expose systematic problems in how American society approaches mental illness. The legal framework provides no protection for patients and no standards for institutional care. Families have few options when mental illness strikes, leading them to surrender relatives to whatever local institution will accept them. Public officials view caring for the mentally ill as an unavoidable expense to be minimized rather than a social obligation to be fulfilled responsibly. The economic analysis in Dix's notebooks demonstrates that adequate care for mentally ill people would require substantial public investment at a time when most communities struggle to provide basic services. Local officials consistently explain poor conditions by reference to limited budgets, arguing that taxpayers will not support higher expenditures for people who contribute nothing to community welfare. This reasoning creates a vicious cycle where inadequate funding produces conditions that make recovery impossible, confirming public prejudices about the incurability of mental illness. But Dix's investigation also uncovers examples of more enlightened approaches that demonstrate alternatives to the system she is documenting. A few institutions employ attendants who treat patients with basic humanity, provide work assignments that occupy troubled minds constructively, and maintain clean, adequately heated facilities. These exceptions prove that better care is possible when administrators commit resources and staff to humane treatment rather than mere containment. The individual case studies in her notebooks reveal the human cost of systematic neglect in terms that statistics cannot capture. A young woman in Danvers has been confined naked in an unheated shed for 2 winters. Her family having been told that clothing would only be torn and that heat would make her more violent. A man in Concord spends his days chained to a post in a barn fed once daily through a slot in the door, his family believing that isolation is the only way to manage his condition. An elderly woman in Northampton sits motionless in a corner of an almshouse cellar, having been silent for so long that staff members no longer remember her name or the circumstances of her confinement. These cases allow Dix to demonstrate that mental illness affects people from all social classes and backgrounds, contradicting popular beliefs that madness primarily strikes the poor and morally degenerate. Her notebooks document the stories of former teachers, merchants, farmers, and craftsmen whose mental symptoms led to the loss of their social status and economic security, along with their freedom. These stories humanize mental illness in ways that challenge comfortable assumptions about the social distance between the sane and the insane. As her investigation nears completion, Dix faces the challenge of transforming her private documentation into public advocacy. The detailed evidence she has collected is often too graphic to present directly to mixed audiences, but she cannot sanitize her findings without undermining their emotional impact. She must also find a way to present her case to male legislators who may question both her authority to address public policy questions and the accuracy of her observations. The strategy she develops reflects both her understanding of contemporary political processes and her recognition of the constraints that gender places on her activism. Rather than attempting to address the legislature directly, which would violate social conventions and probably prove ineffective, she will prepare a formal written memorial that can be presented by a male ally while she remains appropriately in the background. This memorial must combine moral outrage with practical proposals, statistical evidence with compelling individual stories, and Christian principles with political pragmatism. The writing process forces Dix to make difficult decisions about how to present evidence that is both shocking enough to motivate action and respectable enough to be taken seriously by conservative political leaders. She decides to focus on the most extreme cases while making clear that they represent common rather than exceptional practices. She emphasizes the economic costs of current policies, the waste of potentially productive citizens, and the inefficiency of institutional arrangements that prevent recovery rather than promoting it. The memorial also reveals Dix's sophisticated understanding of American political culture and the arguments most likely to persuade legislators to act. She frames her appeal in terms of Christian duty, civic responsibility, and economic efficiency rather than abstract theories about human rights. She cites successful examples of institutional reform from other states and European countries to demonstrate that change is both necessary and possible. As she prepares to submit her memorial to the Massachusetts legislature in January 1843, Dix understands that she has committed herself to a public role that will transform her life permanently. Success will require her to continue advocating for legislative action to oversee the implementation of any reforms that result, and to expand her efforts to other states where similar conditions exist. Failure will leave her exposed to public ridicule as a woman who overstepped proper boundaries while accomplishing nothing for the people whose suffering motivated her campaign. But the faces and voices recorded in her notebooks provide constant motivation for the risks she is taking. The woman chained in the cellar, the man isolated in the barn, the elderly woman whose name has been forgotten. They represent thousands of Americans whose mental illness has rendered them invisible to society and powerless to advocate for themselves. The question that will determine the success of her memorial is whether written words can convey the reality she has witnessed with sufficient force to overcome the indifference, ignorance, and economic constraints that perpetuate their suffering. On January 19, 1843, you sit in the gallery of the Massachusetts State House as Dr. Luther Bell rises to present Dorothea Dix's memorial to the legislature, carrying with him a document that will transform American attitudes toward mental illness and establish the template for social reform advocacy throughout the 19th century. The scene embodies the constraints and possibilities of reform in antebellum America. A woman with no political rights working through male allies to present evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about society's obligations to its most vulnerable members, The memorial itself represents a masterpiece of political rhetoric that combines moral outrage with practical analysis, statistical documentation with compelling narrative, and Christian principles with economic arguments. Dix has crafted her presentation to speak to multiple constituencies. Simultaneously, religious leaders concerned with Christian duty, practical politicians focused on fiscal responsibility, and reform-minded citizens motivated by humanitarian concern. The opening lines establish the moral framework that will govern everything that follows. I respectfully ask to present this memorial, believing that the cause, which actuates to and sanctions so unusual a movement, presents no equivocal claim to public consideration and sympathy. The first section of the memorial provides statistical evidence that transforms scattered individual tragedies into a systematic social problem requiring government action. Dix presents precise numbers: more than 1,000 mentally ill people confined in Massachusetts institutions under conditions that violate basic standards of human decency. But she supplements these statistics with carefully chosen individual cases that personalize the abstract data and force legislators to confront the human consequences of their policy choices. The case studies in the memorial have been selected and presented with extraordinary skill to maximize their emotional impact while maintaining the respectability necessary for serious political consideration. She describes a woman in Danvers confined in an unheated outbuilding during harsh winters, her clothing having rotted away, her condition having deteriorated from treatable melancholy into complete physical and mental collapse. But Dix presents this case not as sensational entertainment, but as evidence of systematic policy failure that wastes human potential and violates Christian principles. The economic arguments in the memorial demonstrate Dix's sophisticated understanding of the practical considerations that drive political decision-making. She calculates the costs of current policies, not just the immediate expenses of minimal institutional care, but the long-term costs of maintaining people in permanent dependency, rather than providing treatment that might restore them to productive citizenship. She also presents evidence from other jurisdictions where investments in proper mental health care have produced both humanitarian benefits and fiscal savings. The memorial's discussion of successful reform models serves multiple rhetorical purposes. It demonstrates that better approaches are possible, provides specific blueprints for improvement, and addresses potential objections that reform would be too expensive or impractical. Dix describes the moral treatment being practiced at a few pioneering American institutions and cites examples from European countries where systematic approaches to mental health care have produced remarkable results in both patient outcomes and cost management. But the most powerful sections of the memorial are those that challenge prevailing assumptions about the nature and curability of mental illness. Dix presents evidence that many people currently confined as hopelessly insane actually suffer from treatable conditions that could be addressed through proper medical care and humane institutional practices. She argues that current policies create chronicity by subjecting patients to conditions that would drive anyone to desperation, and that providing appropriate treatment could restore many to useful lives. The legislative response to the memorial reveals both the power of Dix's presentation and the complexity of translating moral conviction into political action. Many legislators express genuine shock at the conditions she describes and acknowledge the moral obligation to address them. But questions immediately arise about funding mechanisms, administrative structures, and the proper role of state government in providing services traditionally handled at the local level. The debate that follows demonstrates how Dix's memorial has transformed the terms of discussion about mental illness policy. Legislators who once viewed caring for the insane as a private family responsibility or minimal public duty now find themselves debating the details of therapeutic approaches, architectural requirements for proper institutional design and staffing, standards for mental health facilities. The memorial has succeeded in making systematic reform seem not only morally necessary, but practically achievable. Opposition to the memorial comes primarily from fiscal conservatives, who question whether taxpayers should bear the costs of improved mental health care, and from local officials who resist state interference in their traditional authority over institutional management. But these opponents find themselves on uncomfortable moral ground, forced to argue explicitly that human suffering should be tolerated to avoid increased public expenditure. The legislative process reveals the broader significance of Dix's achievement, beyond its specific impact on mental health policy. Her memorial has demonstrated that private citizens can successfully challenge government policies through systematic documentation and effective advocacy. The precedent she has established will be followed by other reformers addressing different social problems throughout the 19th century. The bill that emerges from legislative consideration represents a compromise that falls short of Dix's full agenda, but nevertheless constitutes a revolutionary change in American approaches to mental illness. The legislation provides funding for a new state hospital designed according to moral treatment principles, establishes minimum standards for institutions housing mentally ill people, and creates oversight mechanisms to ensure compliance with these standards. But perhaps most importantly, the law officially recognizes mental illness as a medical condition deserving of treatment, rather than a moral failing requiring only punishment or containment. This conceptual change has implications that extend far beyond institutional policy to influence legal proceedings, family relationships, and social attitudes toward people with mental health problems. The implementation of the new law proves to be as challenging as its passage, requiring Dix to maintain her advocacy role throughout the process of site selection, architectural planning, staff recruitment, and operational development for the new state hospital. Her continued involvement demonstrates that successful reform requires sustained commitment beyond the initial legislative victory. The success of the Massachusetts Memorial establishes Dix as a national figure and creates demand for similar advocacy. In other states, over the following decades, she will travel throughout America, repeating the process she pioneered in Massachusetts: systematic investigation, detailed documentation, and carefully crafted political presentation. By the time of her death in 1887, she will have directly influenced the creation of more than 30 mental hospitals and transformed American approaches to mental illness care. But the ultimate significance of Dix's achievement lies not just in the institutions she helped create, but in the methods she developed for effective social reform advocacy. Her memorial established the template for evidence-based policy advocacy that combines moral conviction with practical analysis, statistical documentation with human storytelling, and political pragmatism with unwavering commitment to principle. As you leave the Massachusetts State House after the memorial's successful presentation, you recognize that you have witnessed the birth of modern American social reform advocacy. Dix has demonstrated that individual citizens can successfully challenge systematic injustice through careful investigation, effective communication, and persistent political engagement. The methods she has pioneered will be used by reformers, addressing everything from prison conditions to child labor to women's rights, throughout the remainder of the 19th century and beyond. You stand beside Thomas Story Kirkbride in the autumn of 1840 as he surveys the construction site of what will become the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, watching workers lay the foundation stones for a building that embodies an entirely new philosophy about the relationship between architecture and healing. At 31, Kirkbride has already established himself as a physician committed to the moral treatment of mental illness. But this massive construction project represents his attempt to create the physical environment that will make such treatment possible on an unprecedented scale. The building taking shape before you will become the model for mental health institutions throughout America and establish architectural principles that influence hospital design well into the 20th century. The site itself reflects Kirkbride's understanding that environment plays a crucial role in mental health. Located on 101 acres in West Philadelphia, the hospital sits far enough from the city to provide peaceful surroundings while remaining accessible to families and colleagues. The extensive grounds include areas for agriculture, recreation, and quiet reflection, based on Kirkbride's belief that patients benefit from exposure to natural beauty and seasonal rhythms that urban institutional life typically destroys. The careful attention to site selection demonstrates his conviction that healing requires more than medical intervention. It demands an entire environment designed to support recovery. The architectural plan that Kirkbride has developed with his collaborators represents a revolutionary departure from traditional institutional design. Instead of the fortress-like structures that characterize most asylums, this building will feature a linear arrangement of connected wings that maximize natural light and air circulation while providing clear sight lines for staff supervision. The central administration building will be flanked by patient wings that extend in a shallow V shape, creating courtyards and gardens that bring outdoor space close to every ward. As you examine the detailed architectural drawings in Kirkbride's office, you discover that every element of the design has been planned to support therapeutic goals. Room sizes have been calculated to house specific numbers of patients while providing adequate space for movement and social interaction. Window placement ensures that natural light reaches every patient area throughout the day, based on Kirkbride's observation that darkness and poor ventilation contribute to mental deterioration. Even the width of corridors has been determined by the practical requirements of moving patients safely and efficiently while maintaining the calm atmosphere essential to recovery. The classification system that will govern patient placement reflects Kirkbride's systematic approach to understanding different types of mental illness. The building will house up to 250 patients divided into 8 distinct classes based on their symptoms, social backgrounds, and prospects for recovery. Each class will occupy separate quarters designed to meet their specific needs: quiet areas for melancholic patients, secure spaces for those prone to violence, and comfortable accommodations for patients from middle-class backgrounds who retain their social sensibilities despite their mental conditions. But Kirkbride's most innovative contribution to institutional design lies in his integration of workspaces throughout the building. Every wing will include workshops, sewing rooms, kitchens, and other areas where patients can engage in productive activity as part of their treatment. This represents a fundamental departure from traditional asylums where work, if provided at all, occurs in separate buildings that reinforce the distinction between therapeutic and productive activities. Kirkbride believes that meaningful work is essential to mental health, and that the building itself should facilitate rather than obstruct such activity. The attention to mechanical systems reveals Kirkbride's commitment to creating an environment that supports health through scientific application of contemporary knowledge about sanitation, ventilation, and temperature control. The building will feature a sophisticated heating system that maintains consistent temperatures throughout the winter, plumbing that provides running water to every floor, and ventilation systems that ensure fresh air circulation in all patient areas. These features, taken for granted in modern hospitals, represented cutting-edge technology in 1840 and demonstrate Kirkbride's determination to provide patients with living conditions superior to those available to most Americans. The staffing plan that Kirkbride develops for the new hospital reflects his understanding that architecture alone cannot produce therapeutic results. The building must be operated by people trained in the principles of moral treatment and committed to treating patients with dignity and respect. He establishes detailed job descriptions for attendants, specifying not only their practical duties, but the attitudes and behaviors expected in their interactions with patients. The building includes living quarters for staff members, recognizing that therapeutic relationships require continuity and consistency that cannot be achieved if attendants view their work merely as temporary employment. Kirkbride's correspondence with reformers and physicians throughout America reveals his understanding that this single hospital represents an experiment with implications far beyond Pennsylvania. If the architectural principles he is implementing prove successful in promoting patient recovery, they could be replicated in other states and eventually transform American approaches to mental health care. If the experiment fails, it could discredit the moral treatment movement and leave thousands of mentally ill people condemned to the custodial care that characterizes most existing institutions. The financial planning for the hospital demonstrates the economic challenges inherent in providing high-quality mental health care. The construction costs far exceed those of traditional institutional buildings, and the operational expenses will require ongoing public support at levels that many taxpayers consider excessive. Kirkbride must balance his therapeutic ideals against practical constraints, making compromises that optimize patient care within available resources while demonstrating fiscal responsibility to skeptical legislators and county commissioners. The legal framework governing the hospital's operation reflects broader questions about the rights and status of mentally ill people in American society. Kirkbride works with lawyers and legislators to develop admission procedures, discharge criteria, and patient protections that balance therapeutic considerations with public safety concerns and family rights. These policies will influence not only how this institution operates, but how mental illness is understood throughout the American legal system. As construction progresses through 1841, you observe Kirkbride's growing reputation within the emerging community of American psychiatrists. His correspondence includes exchanges with Dorothea Dix about institutional reform, consultations with other physicians planning similar facilities, and invitations to lecture about architectural principles at medical schools and professional meetings. The Philadelphia Hospital is becoming a symbol of American progress in mental health care before it even opens its doors, but the challenges of implementing moral treatment on an institutional scale are already becoming apparent as Kirkbride recruits staff and develops operational procedures. Finding attendants who combine practical skills with the temperamental qualities necessary for therapeutic work proves difficult in a society where caring for the mentally ill carries social stigma and offers limited economic advancement. Training programs must be developed to teach moral treatment principles to people with no previous experience in mental health care. The surrounding community's response to the hospital construction reveals persistent ambivalence about mental illness and its treatment. While civic leaders praise the institution as evidence of Philadelphia's progressive character, many residents express concern about having mentally ill people in their vicinity. Property values near the hospital become a source of ongoing controversy, and local officials must balance support for therapeutic innovation with responsiveness to constituent concerns about safety and social order. As the building nears completion, in early 1842, Kirkbride faces the final challenge of translating architectural plans and therapeutic theories into daily operational reality. The beautiful spaces he has created must be filled with people, patients whose mental conditions present complex challenges, staff members whose training and commitment will determine therapeutic outcomes, and administrators whose decisions will influence whether this expensive experiment succeeds or fails. The question that will determine his legacy is whether the careful attention to environmental factors that characterizes his architectural planning can be maintained. When the building becomes home to hundreds of people struggling with the most profound challenges to human reason and emotional stability, 5 years after the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane opened its doors, you accompany Thomas Kirkbride on his morning rounds through the completed institution, observing how architectural theories have been tested by the practical realities of caring for 200 patients with varying forms and degrees of mental illness. The building has achieved much of what Kirkbride envisioned. It provides humane living conditions, supports therapeutic programming, and demonstrates that mental illness can be treated in settings that respect human dignity. But the experience of operating this complex institution has also revealed that limitations and challenges inherent in translating therapeutic ideals into systematic practice. The linear arrangement of patient wings has proven highly effective in supporting the classification system that governs institutional life. As you move through the building from the administration center toward the residential areas, you observe how different types of patients have been housed according to their symptoms, social backgrounds, and treatment needs. The first wing contains recently admitted patients undergoing evaluation and initial treatment. Individuals whose conditions may respond quickly to moral therapy and who maintain many of the social skills and intellectual capabilities they possessed before their illness. Moving further from the center, you encounter patients whose conditions require longer-term treatment, but who retain capacity for productive work and social interaction. These wards buzz with purposeful activity as patients engage in occupational therapy, educational programs, and structured recreation designed to maintain their connection to normal social life while addressing the specific symptoms that prevent their return to community living. The workshops integrated into these wings produce furniture, textiles, and other goods that both support institutional operations and provide patients with meaningful work experience. The final wings house patients whose conditions have proven resistant to moral treatment. Individuals suffering from what later generations will recognize as severe chronic mental illnesses that require permanent institutional care. But even these areas reflect Kirkbride's commitment to maintaining human dignity regardless of therapeutic outcomes. Patients who cannot engage in complex work assignments participate in simple but meaningful activities, and their living spaces provide comfort and safety rather than mere containment. The mechanical systems that Kirkbride specified have transformed the daily experience of institutional life in ways that become apparent only through extended observation. The efficient heating system maintains consistent temperatures that allow patients to dress normally rather than huddling under blankets for warmth. The plumbing provides running water that supports both personal hygiene and the laundry facilities, essential to maintaining the clean clothing that preserves patient dignity. The ventilation systems prevent the accumulation of odors and stale air that characterize older institutions and contribute to the spread of respiratory diseases. The integration of workspaces throughout the building has created what amounts to a therapeutic community where productive activity occurs naturally as part of daily life rather than being segregated in separate industrial areas. You observe patients moving freely between their living quarters and various workshops, participating in institutional operations while receiving treatment for their mental conditions. This integration challenges the traditional distinction between productive and dependent members of society by demonstrating that mental illness need not eliminate an individual's capacity for meaningful contribution, but the success of these architectural innovations has also revealed the crucial importance of human factors that no building design can guarantee. The attendant staff, whose attitudes and behaviors determine the quality of daily patient experience, varies enormously in their commitment to therapeutic principles and their skill in implementing them. Some embrace Kirkbride's vision of moral treatment and develop genuine therapeutic relationships with patients, while others revert to custodial approaches that emphasize order and control over healing and recovery. The training programs that Kirkbride has developed for staff represent his recognition that architecture alone cannot produce therapeutic results. New attendants receive instruction in the principles of moral treatment, practical techniques for managing difficult behaviors without resorting to physical restraint, and the observational skills necessary to monitor patient progress and report meaningful information to medical staff. But translating these principles into consistent practice across all shifts and all wards requires ongoing supervision and reinforcement that strains administrative resources. The patient population has evolved in ways that challenge some of Kirkbride's original assumptions about mental illness and its treatment. While many patients respond well to moral therapy and return to community life, others display conditions that appear to be fundamentally neurological rather than psychological in origin. These patients benefit from humane care but show little improvement regardless of therapeutic intervention. Still others arrive with symptoms complicated by alcohol abuse, physical injuries, or social circumstances that make recovery extremely difficult even when they're fit. Mental conditions improve. The classification system has been refined through experience to accommodate types of mental illness that were not well understood when the hospital was designed. Kirkbride and his staff have learned to distinguish between conditions that respond to different therapeutic approaches, and they have modified ward assignments and treatment programs accordingly. But they have also discovered that some patients do not fit neatly into any classification scheme and require individualized approaches that strain institutional resources. The economic aspects of operating the hospital. According to moral treatment, principles have proven more challenging than Kirkbride anticipated. The high staff-to-patient ratios necessary for therapeutic programming, the maintenance costs of complex mechanical systems, and the overhead expenses of providing comfortable living conditions require ongoing financial support that exceeds the budgets of many potential patients and their families. Kirkbride must balance therapeutic ideals against economic realities, making compromises that optimize care within available resources. The success of the Pennsylvania hospital has generated requests for consultation from officials planning similar institutions throughout America. Kirkbride finds himself traveling extensively to advise on-site selection, architectural planning, and operational development for hospitals from Maine to California. These consultations have led to the standardization of design principles that become known as the Kirkbride Plan, a systematic approach to asylum architecture that influences institutional construction for the remainder of the 19th century. The correspondence from other institutions implementing Kirkbride Plan buildings reveals both the possibilities and limitations of replicating successful models in different contexts. Some hospitals achieve therapeutic results comparable to those in Philadelphia, while others struggle with inadequate funding, poorly trained staff, or local political pressures that compromise their therapeutic mission. Kirkbride learns that architectural plans are only as effective as the people and policies that animate them. The research program that Kirkbride has established at the Pennsylvania Hospital represents his commitment to advancing scientific understanding of mental illness through systematic observation and data collection. Detailed case records document patient histories, symptoms, treatments, and outcomes with unprecedented precision, creating a database that reveals patterns invisible in individual cases. This research contributes to the emerging field of psychiatry and provides evidence about the effectiveness of different therapeutic approaches. The treatment outcomes at the Pennsylvania Hospital provide encouragement for moral therapy advocates while revealing the complex factors that influence recovery from mental illness. Patients admitted during acute episodes often respond rapidly to humane care and therapeutic programming, with many returning to normal community life within months. But patients with chronic conditions or those from impoverished backgrounds show less dramatic improvement, suggesting that social and economic factors play important roles in both the development and treatment of mental illness. As you complete your observation of the mature Pennsylvania hospital, you recognize that Kirkbride has achieved something remarkable. He has demonstrated that systematic attention to environmental factors can significantly improve the treatment of mental illness while maintaining fiscal responsibility and community support. His architectural innovations have provided a template that other reformers can adapt to their local circumstances and resources. But the broader implementation of the Kirkbride Plan principles faces challenges that a single successful institution cannot overcome alone. The expense of building and operating therapeutic institutions limits their availability to patients whose families can afford private care, or to communities wealthy enough to support them through public funding. The shortage of trained staff threatens to compromise therapeutic programming even in well-designed facilities, and persistent social attitudes about mental illness continue to support custodial approaches that emphasize containment over treatment. The question that will determine Kirkbride's ultimate influence on American mental healthcare is whether the principles he has demonstrated can be scaled up to serve the broader population of mentally ill Americans while maintaining the therapeutic standards that make institutional care genuinely helpful rather than merely humane. The architectural legacy he is creating will outlast his lifetime, but its therapeutic value will depend on future generations' commitment to the moral treatment principles that inspired its design. By 1880, nearly 4 decades after the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane first opened its doors, you return to find Thomas Story Kirkbride, now 71 and nearing the end of his career, presiding over an institution that has achieved legendary status within American psychiatry while grappling with the same fundamental challenges that confront every attempt to treat mental illness systematically. The building itself has aged gracefully, its solid construction and thoughtful design proving their worth through decades of intensive use. But the broader legacy of the Kirkbride Plan extends far beyond this single institution to encompass dozens of hospitals across America, each representing both the possibilities and limitations of architectural solutions to human suffering. The statistical record of the Pennsylvania Hospital provides compelling evidence for the effectiveness of moral treatment implemented within properly designed facilities. Over nearly 4 decades of operation, the institution has achieved discharge rates significantly higher than those of custodial facilities, with many former patients returning to productive lives in their communities. The detailed case records maintained under Kirkbride's direction document hundreds of individual success stories while also revealing the complex factors that influence recovery from mental illness. But the hospital's evolution over time also illustrates the inherent tensions between therapeutic ideals and institutional realities. The patient population has grown from 200 to over 400, straining the physical capacity of the building and altering the staff-to-patient ratios that made intensive therapeutic programming possible. The classification system has been modified repeatedly to accommodate new understanding of mental illness, while managing overcrowding that makes pure implementation of moral treatment principles increasingly difficult. The Kirkbride Plan buildings, constructed throughout America during the mid-19th century, represent both Kirkbride's triumph and the ultimate test of his theories. From the massive Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts to the elegant Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, these institutions demonstrate that his architectural principles can be adapted to different climates, patient populations, and local resources. But they also reveal how easily therapeutic intentions can be compromised by inadequate funding, poor administration, or social attitudes that view mental hospitals primarily as places of containment rather than treatment. The success of some Kirkbride Plan institutions has vindicated his belief that environmental factors play crucial roles in mental health treatment. Hospitals like the one in Utica, New York, have maintained therapeutic programming and achieved good patient outcomes through decades of operation, demonstrating that well-designed facilities can support effective treatment when properly staffed and administered. These institutions serve as models for hospital design throughout the world and establish American leadership in progressive mental health care. But other Kirkbride Plan buildings tell more troubling stories about the difficulty of sustaining therapeutic communities within large institutional settings. Overcrowding, understaffing, and inadequate funding have transformed some of these elegant structures into little more than warehouses for the mentally ill. Their beautiful architecture providing pleasant surroundings for lives of enforced idleness rather than therapeutic engagement. The contrast between Kirkbride's intentions and these disappointing realities illustrates the complex relationship between physical environment and human outcomes. The economic pressures affecting mental health care have intensified as patient populations have grown and public expectations about treatment have risen. The high per-patient costs of moral treatment, which were manageable when institutions served relatively small numbers of middle-class patients, become prohibitive when applied to the masses of indigent, mentally ill people seeking care. Kirkbride and his colleagues find themselves caught between their therapeutic principles and the political reality that taxpayers will not support expensive treatment for people viewed as unproductive burdens on society. The professionalization of psychiatry during Kirkbride's career has been influenced significantly by his systematic approach to institutional design and patient care. The Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, which he helped found, has established standards for hospital construction, staff training, and patient treatment that reflect many of his innovations. But professionalization has also introduced new tensions between medical authority and patient rights, between scientific objectivity and humanitarian concern. The treatment approaches employed within Kirkbride plan buildings have evolved considerably from the original moral therapy that inspired their design. New understanding of mental illness has led to more sophisticated classification systems, pharmaceutical interventions, and therapeutic techniques that require different types of facilities and staff training. Some of these innovations have improved patient outcomes, while others have moved treatment away from the environmental emphasis that was central to Kirkbride's approach. The social context surrounding mental health care has changed dramatically during Kirkbride's career, with implications for both institutional design and treatment philosophy. Urbanization and immigration have created patient populations that differ significantly from the largely rural, native-born Americans for whom moral treatment was originally developed. Industrial accidents and military service have produced new types of mental conditions that challenge traditional understanding of psychiatric disorders. Changes in family structure and community organization have altered the social supports available to mentally ill people and their relatives. The international influence of American asylum design reflects the broader impact of Kirkbride's work. Beyond national borders, European physicians and architects have studied American institutional innovations, adapting Kirkbride plan principles to their own cultural contexts and medical traditions. This international exchange has enriched understanding of mental illness, while revealing both the universal aspects of psychiatric treatment and the cultural specificity of therapeutic approaches. The research legacy of the Pennsylvania Hospital and other Kirkbride plan institutions has contributed significantly to scientific understanding of mental illness and its treatment. The detailed case records maintained at these facilities have provided data for studies of psychiatric epidemiology, treatment effectiveness, and the natural history of different mental conditions. This research has advanced psychiatry as a medical specialty while raising new questions about the relationship between individual pathology and social conditions. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Kirkbride's legacy lies in his demonstration that institutional design can be guided by humanitarian principles without sacrificing practical effectiveness or fiscal responsibility. The buildings he inspired represent permanent monuments to the possibility of treating society's most vulnerable members with dignity and respect, while pursuing genuine therapeutic goals rather than mere containment. Even when these institutions fail to achieve their full therapeutic potential, they embody values that challenge custodial approaches to mental health care. As Kirkbride prepares to retire from active leadership of the Pennsylvania Hospital, he faces questions about the future of the architectural principles he has championed. New theories about mental illness emphasize biological rather than environmental causes, suggesting that treatment should focus on medical interventions rather than moral therapy. Economic pressures favor larger, more efficient institutions that sacrifice individual attention for administrative convenience. Social attitudes increasingly view mental illness as a chronic condition, requiring permanent care rather than a treatable disorder amenable to recovery. The Kirkbride Plan buildings that dot the American landscape represent both an achievement and a challenge to future generations of mental health professionals. They demonstrate that humane treatment of mental illness is possible within institutional settings when proper attention is given to environmental factors, staff training, and therapeutic programming. But they also illustrate the difficulty of sustaining such treatment when social commitment wavers, resources become scarce, or theoretical fashions change. The ultimate question posed by Kirkbride's legacy is whether American society will continue to support the expensive, labor-intensive approach to mental health care that his buildings were designed to facilitate, or whether economic and political pressures will transform these therapeutic institutions into the custodial facilities that moral treatment was meant to replace. The beautiful buildings will survive regardless, but their architectural success will prove meaningful only if future generations maintain the commitment to human dignity and therapeutic optimism that inspired their construction. This comprehensive, historical narrative of approximately 22,000 words explores the fascinating yet troubling world of 1800s insane asylums through 4 interconnected stories that reveal how well-intentioned reforms often collided with harsh institutional realities. From Colney Hatch's transformation into an industrial asylum to Penal's revolutionary unchaining of patients. From Dix's crusading advocacy to Kirkbride's architectural vision of healing. These stories illuminate why anyone confined to such places would indeed lose sleep, not from fear alone, but from the grinding daily machinery of institutional life that reduced human beings to manageable units and systems too large and complex for genuine healing.